Barry Howard, visionary exhibit designer for the Galveston Railroad Museum. Commissioned by Mary Moody Northen to bring her vision to reality, Barry Howard is the creative mind behind the Galveston Railroad Museum. From concept to creation, he transformed the idea into a living, interactive experience that continues to captivate visitors. Internationally acclaimed for his work, Barry's portfolio includes the Guam Museum, American Freedom Train, Hollywood Entertainment Museum, Indian Arts Museum, California State Railroad Museum, and the National Prisoner of War Museum, among others. His career stands as a testament to the power of design in preserving and celebrating history.
So my name is Barry Howard, and my peculiar career has been mostly interpreting American history and ethnology through creative, interactive museums. I was very pleased to be a part of Galveston's museum plans when I was contacted by Ed Protz to become involved.
How did Mary Moody Northen find you, and what was your first impression of the vision she had for a new museum?
I didn't really meet Ms. Northen until I had a grasp on what I wanted to do. For example, the notion of entering the museum at the other end of the property and then utilizing a couple of the old storage buildings as part of the visitor experience, so that coming into the major waiting room would be the big surprise. And I explained that to her, and I told her that what I had learned thus far about Galveston's history as a port of immigration, which a lot of people in this country weren't aware of. I wanted to build that interest before looking at locomotives and cars. Simple as that. And she was a very nice woman.
When you first began developing this concept, what was that early experience like, and what challenges did you encounter as you worked to bring your vision to life?
When I first came to Galveston, they had just begun the remodeling of the Santa Fe building. And there was an architectural firm involved in that process. The firm was a firm called Ford Powell Carson out of Dallas. And their chief guy on the project was Boone Powell. And he looked at me as kind of like an intruder. What was I doing while he was remodeling the building? So after a while, we got to know each other. And designers and architects sometimes don't see things the same way. I was interested in the visitor experience, coming away with a knowledge they didn't have before, and to celebrate what rolling stock eventually would be on site. So it was kind of, everything was kind of in a mix at the moment. A lot of concrete and wood and stuff moving around.
Did your work involve researching Galveston's history, and how did that research shape the story you chose to tell through the museum?
The thing about designing museums, it's not just about objects, it's not just about the major aspects of history. It's kind of like anecdotal history that people really come to enjoy. So I did a lot of research here in Galveston, a lot of chatting with people who've been around for quite a while, and I began to get a feel for things. So I started asking a lot of questions. That's the normal thing to do. And little by little, I realized that I could convey something here to visitors which brought Galveston into the history of the United States of America, as far as I'm concerned. Even back in the days when the island was once Spanish, once French, once Mexican, and searching for identity was part of the storyline, which I enjoyed conveying in a lot of ways in the exhibition galleries.
When you began designing the museum, what was the state of railroad travel at that time, and how did you choose to present it in a way that immersed visitors in that experience?
Well, in the 70s, there was still passenger traffic, but passenger traffic in general in this country had diminished compared to trucks conveying commercial goods, and everybody was flying. A lot of people weren't enjoying the comforts of a railroad car. So part of the story was going back to the days when rail was the only way you could get anywhere. And again, that's the way you present things, is to bring your visitor into a storyline, make them part of it. And I think that's what it did. I did a lot of research. And I had a staff, of course. I didn't do everything myself. In those days, I had between 15 or 20 people on staff. And so that's how we developed these things. Not a lot of passengers. It wasn't a heavy schedule. Local traffic, yeah. Texas railroading as opposed to national railroading. But the Santa Fe was main occupant of that building.
Who determined what artifacts to bring in and the overall decor for the depot? Where did the trains come from?
One of the problems, actually, that we had at the outset was the railroad. It wasn't only a railroad museum. It was what we called the Museum of Transportation and Commerce, because the financing for the project came from the Moody Foundation, which was an industrial organization. And I felt that we had to talk about domestic and international commerce. I wasn't too heavy on the types of rolling stock in the yards because there wasn't that much. Certainly not local, except for the wobbly bobbly, whatever, turnover and stop, which became our little railroad locomotive of feature. I got a kick out of that. But anyway, it was the local railroads. And that was the best we had of Galveston Railroad history. The Anacapa was certainly a private car that belonged to this museum. It's always good to see private cars. But we made do. Ed Protz actually went up to Washington State and Oregon and picked up some rolling stock from the Pacific Northwest Railroad, which is now part of the BNSF. So he did a lot of looking for me to have some things to play with.
What additional elements did you build into the museum's design to help visitors engage with and understand Galveston's history?
That's the thing. It wasn't just the rolling stock. It was everything from the way people enjoyed being in Galveston. You remember, if you've seen pictures of it, I don't think it's extant any longer. But we had this idea of reflecting on the very heavy German immigration of the late 19th century and into the 20th century. So we recreated this Gartenverein experience, and I used that as a device to create images of Galveston from its earliest days as a transportation facility. And it was like having one of those devices where you just click and it changes the image to 3D holographically, but you are actually in an environment that looked like an old German place to have fun in the evening.
What was the original spark or idea that led to the creation of the Ghosts of Travelers Past exhibit?
As I learned about history and about the decades of use of the train coming out of Galveston, imagine the number of people who came in through the port. They didn't all stay in Galveston. They went and got on trains and went out through Texas and the Southwest. And the idea was to present that not as a narrative, but as if you were one of the travelers in the waiting room. The notion of presenting history from the Galveston point of view, I thought tied in beautifully to having people talk to you, or the visitor, let's say, talk to the visitor about what was going on in that time. For example, we know that there are always polarization of political views in this country, as we know today, and there was all throughout our history. So two guys which were part of the white sculpture environment, when you picked up the tethered earphone and put it to your ear, you'd be hearing the arguments about whether President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was right to bring us into the war in Europe, and whether or not so many people thought we should stay out of it. And that's a way of presenting history in context, because the people who were talking to each other were travelers on the train. There was one fellow who said goodbye to his daughter or granddaughter, saying he'll be back, and she was crying. So the little kids would pick up that device and listen to it, get a feeling for what it was like to be a youngster. And that was just a flash of insight that came to me, period.
How did your relationship with the Schwartz brothers begin, and what led you to bring them on to create the Ghosts of Travelers Past exhibit?
I was able to find the right sculptors for the project. I had met them first. I think that you might know what the American Freedom Train was in 1976, which was probably the most challenging project that I ever did. And in the course of that, I wanted the people who came aboard the American Freedom Train exhibition to hear firsthand about the people who make up this country. So they sculpted the heads of actors that I put back on mannequin bodies, who talk to you as you, the visitor, move through the American Freedom Train exhibition. And these guys were so good at recreating those faces that I said, well, they could do all the sculptures. And I think I brought Ed Protz up to meet them on the East Coast. And they are in business today, although one of them has passed away, but they're still there. Being able to look backwards toward the history of the use of the railroad in Galveston by having people as images that recreate a time and place, not an individual person. But it also gave, using mannequins, if you will, which is the wrong word because the sculptures are of real people, but they were all in white, so that the environment became rich around them, and the stories they told were very believable. For example, there was one fellow who was talking to a seated gentleman who was asking, the visitor was asking guidance about where he should go and enjoy and have a good time in Galveston. It was at a time when Galveston had its share of speakeasies, etc. And the young gentleman behind the desk said, if I were you, I'd leave your ticket with me, so I'd be sure you can get out of town when you're finished.
Were you part of the Anacapa acquisition?
Well, let's talk about rolling stock. As I say, there wasn't much native rolling stock at the time. Nobody had a collection that you could just transfer into the museum. So Mr. Protz did a lot of that research himself to find cars and, as I say, rolling stock, locomotives that would have some association with the Southwest, not just with Galveston. It wasn't that easy to find cars like the Anacapa. Private cars were of great value, and the restoration of these cars was very expensive. But Ed was terrific. He would never hear anybody say no, you can't have it.
What was your take on Galveston and the effort to preserve history?
Historical facts and facts that are not well known will come out in conversations with people who've lived on the island of Galveston for their whole lives. And providing that kind of experience to contemporary visitors, you just don't want it to be a narrative. You want to put it in context. So a lot of research was involved. And I had a lot of help from local people who've lived their lives in Galveston. And there was a lot of things I didn't know. When I first came to Galveston, remember that it was early in the timeline of restoring the Santa Fe building and the waiting room downstairs. So there were a lot of things that emerged from my first time in Galveston that made me want to ask questions. And I think I was able to bring that to the public without it being a single narrative, but how it was remembered by different kinds of people who came to Galveston from different places, which I think is the only way to really enjoy history, to become a part of the storyline.
How do you plan for museums to evolve over the years, and what elements tend to stay the same?
But the thing about being a designer of museums, which is what I've done for 60 years, is that you can't expect the exhibitions or the storylines to remain vital for more than 5 or 6 years at a time. Otherwise, the experience becomes kind of boring. So I expect the interior of the museum, any museum that I do, to change over the years. In doing museum planning, you have to take into consideration not just the artifacts, but the flow of people, how much information you'd like them to come away with. If you move them too quickly, they won't remember what they saw. If they come through too quickly or too slowly, they become annoying to the people behind them. So a museum is a place where you have to understand how people respond and how you can get your message across most effectively. That's part of the planning of a museum as much as architecture is. And I heard a lot of stories about the history of Galveston, some of which I didn't repeat.
What was your main challenge in creating the museum?
The challenge of creating a museum begins with the conversation, which in turn leads to research, which in turn inspires the kinds of media and methodologies that you use to reach out to people. And from my point of view, the bones of a museum remain in terms of how people move through it, how fast and how slowly they move, the information that we want them to retain. Those are basic challenges to begin with. And to do it then, to create the kinds of experiences that provide that information in something other than a guided narrative from a person who doesn't sound like they know what went on. That's the challenge, is to make it interactive and immersive wherever possible, so that people can get into the storyline. And we just used a lot of media for that purpose.
When you think of traditional museum design, what comes to mind, and in what ways does your approach differ from that model?
The word museum goes back to the days when archaeologists went out and found all kinds of Greek vases and a variety of evidence of human occupation, put them in a glass box with a little typewritten card that says, "This vase did such and such." When I opened my practice in 1965, My idea was to tell stories in museums and have them authenticated by the objects that were recovered from that period of time. So although artifacts are very valuable, and I respect them in museums, it's the storylines that people remember.
When you walk back into a museum you helped create, what are the key things you look for?
Actually, I'm looking forward to seeing the museum today through the eyes of a visitor in 2025, when you remember that this work was done in the 1970s and opened early in the 80s. It's quite a while ago.
Did you attend the grand opening of the museum?
The interesting thing about creating a museum for me historically is that I try to disappear when the public comes through the museum, because it's not about me. It wasn't about Ed Protz either. The Moody Foundation, without their financing, without their support, and it's true about almost all the museums in the world, needs a benefactor. So I faded into the background, and I must tell you, I don't have very clear recollections of the opening day of the museum. I just hope the visitors would enjoy it.
From your perspective, what universal challenges confront museums everywhere, and what aspects of this project presented truly singular hurdles?
Well, first of all, audiences are the same everywhere. And you've got to be talking to kids, you've got to be talking to their parents, grandparents, and what have you. So from that point of view, you just got to be aware of how you deal with people. But I think the first time I came into the old building and somebody pointed out to me the height of the water on the island in that very first hurricane of 1900, it was really challenging for me to imagine what happens if there's a hurricane the day we finish the museum. And we can talk about that a little bit, but seeing that high water mark on the inside of the building, I knew I had a challenge. But I think we met that challenge by having everything be movable.
Looking ahead, what lasting legacy do you envision this museum leaving for Galveston and for the generations that follow?
With respect to the general purpose of a museum, it was my hope that people would get to know the history and the people of Galveston, whether they're coming in on a cruise ship and they have 8 hours to be on the island, or their families have been here for decades. So I had to be respectful, which I always am, of local history, but I also think it was important to integrate the history of people in Galveston with the rest of the nation and the world. And I think we accomplished that.
What aspects of museum design endure across generations, and which components do you believe must adapt as audiences and technology change?
Well, the longevity of a museum, whether we're talking about Galveston or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Chicago, it's important to understand that the opening exhibition may change dramatically over a period of a decade or 2 decades or 3. Many of the museums that I've designed are extant after 40 or 50 years. And when I go back and look at them, I realize that it's not as painful as it might be for me to see some very clever way that we handled an issue at the time. It has to be modern, it has to be contemporary, and I certainly endorse museums that are constantly changing with the times. But the bones of the experience are born with the very first way you use the space.
Thinking back to your earliest visit, what stood out to you about Galveston and the character of the place?
One of the things I remember in my first impressions of Galveston was that, I guess being a native New Yorker, I didn't know much about Galveston, Texas. But that's not surprising because the museums I've designed all over the world, I knew very little about until somebody said, will you help us out and create environments that people will remember? So I had to learn for myself about Galveston. And that way, I think, when I faced the real questions that people had, I was able to enjoy the answers along with the people who came to experience the museum. And that's really my greatest reward for the work that I do, is to learn about other people and help interpret their lives on a larger canvas.
You've built an extraordinary body of work over the years. What enduring lessons have you carried forward from those experiences?
I think the great reward for me as a designer is to have learned as much as I have and to have had the privilege of interpreting that history for generations beyond my own. I think it's a great satisfaction for me to know that I have had a hand in helping people understand the flow of civilization, particularly when it comes to not just physical things, but the ethnology and composition of who an American is and who we would like to be for people to come visit us from outside this country. And that's where my greatest reward lies. It ain't money.
When you look at the legacy you've built, what part of it feels most satisfying to you personally?
For my own part, I would say that the greatest satisfaction I have is to break down barriers to learning. I think that the experience of going through a museum that impresses people, that has some joy to it and some serious aspects, but being able to get people generation after generation whose ability to learn and retain information has been subjugated by the miracle of technology. Communication technologies have had a very negative impact, in my view, of how you learn about people and how you learn about progress. It's too easy to find the answers without going through the experience of learning. And every museum I've ever done has enough depth so there's more to come, and it can be updated and still be a positive experience.